Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for Kentucky Spins Tuesday Tips. Today, we're going to be talking about language and speech delay in young children. We have a very special guest speaker with us, Laura Miller, and she will be giving us all the tips that we need about speech and language delay. But first, before we get started with the presentation, just a little bit of housekeeping. On your dashboard, you will see a drop-down box that says handouts, and in there is one handout, but it also has the PowerPoint, and it also has all of the links and references that Laura will be talking about today during the presentation. If you don't want to download the handout during the presentation today, I will be sending a follow-up email in later this afternoon to let you have that handout if you don't want to take the time to download it right now. I don't think I introduced myself to you. I am Stella Beard with Kentucky Spin, and I want to tell you just a little bit about Kentucky Spin. We are the Parent Training and Information Center for the state of Kentucky. We are actually funded by the U.S. Department of Education, and we have been the Parent Training and Information Center for Kentucky since 1988. And I'm happy to say we were just funded again for another 5 years. So we are very excited that we are going to still be able to provide training, information, and support for children and youth with all types of disabilities, birth through age 26. We work with families, parents, and professionals. Something that we do not do here at Kentucky Spin is we do not act as attorneys. So we do not provide families legal advice or direct them in a specific way. But what we do is we empower families to effectively advocate for their children, and we provide that peer support to help families access needed information and resources. All of our staff are either a parent of a child or a young adult with an intellectual or developmental disability. They are a sibling of someone with an intellectual or developmental disability, or they have a disability themselves. So we are able to provide that peer support to help families. I myself have a 24-year-old named Clayton with an intellectual disability. So I've lived this my entire life. And so I feel like I can connect with families on that level very well. And we show this slide at all of our presentations because together we can accomplish great things for our children. And none of us have all the answers, and we're all working through this pandemic and adjusting as we go. And way back in March, when the pandemic first hit, we at Kentucky Spin decided to take all of our trainings that we normally do face-to-face and provide them virtually to families. And we have been doing that every week since the beginning of March or the middle of March when all of this happened. And so I'm very happy to say that we have a wonderful video library on our webpage now that you can go back and look at all of our past webinars and just watch and catch up and learn some great information as we're all kind of working from home and adjusting to all of the changes during the pandemic. And we have since then added some great speakers to our lineup. And so today I am very happy to say we have Laura Miller, and she is a professional learning coach with the West Kentucky Educational Cooperative. So we're very excited that she is going to be talking to us today about language and speech delay in young children. And I'm going to let Laura have the floor here in just a second, but she wanted to ask some questions of everyone, and so I have put these questions up on this slide. Now, also on that dashboard on your right-hand side, you're going to see a chat box and you're going to see a question box, and it really just depends on which one you want to type into. Some folks can't have access to the chat box. We're not really sure why. You do have to use the little arrow in front of the name. Like if it says chat, there's a little arrow pointing, and it says if you hover over it, you can expand or collapse the pane, and then that's where you can type in. But if you would just take a few minutes, and I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and she can get things ready while you all are typing in the questions on this page right here. So are you a parent of a child with a disability? If yes, what age? Are you a teacher or a speech language pathologist? Do you have kids or work with kids who are augmentative and alternative communication, or the acronym AAC users? And is there anything specific you would like to learn about today? So as you all are typing those in, I believe Kelly is on the line with us. And while Laura and I are trading over, passing the baton back and forth, Kelly, if you could monitor those questions and answers and let us know what you see.
Absolutely.
I see your page, Laura, so you're good.
All right. Well, are we ready to get started then? Has anybody been able to answer and let me know a little bit about who we've got listening?
I apologize. Yes, we have parents. Let's see. We have someone who's not a parent. I don't know if they're I don't know if they're professionals, but they're not parents. We have a disability and mental health support specialist, and then someone who works with Head Start.
Okay. All right. A little bit of a variety. Variety is always good, brings different perspectives. Is anybody familiar or had any work with AAC? Either has a child that uses AAC or has worked with anyone?
I don't see anybody that has said that somebody said no, not that I'm aware of. No, so I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Well, we will talk a little bit about it today, and then maybe there might be people who may be needing it in your world. Well, we'll go ahead then and just get started. So Stella had reached out to ask me to provide some language and speech tips. So that's what we'll do today, is we'll discuss that as well. And we're going to focus on students who have some of the more complex or are more impacted by their language or speech delay. And so we're, like the title says, we're going to talk about opening doors through communication. Let's see. All right, so let me start by just telling you a little bit more about me. I do work for the West Kentucky Educational Cooperative, and as Stella said, I'm a professional learning coach. And if you're like me, you have no idea what that means. Until I became one, I wasn't sure what that was. And so my first 20 years of my career, I was a speech pathologist in a public school district. I worked primarily with kiddos 4th grade through age 21, but did dabble in the younger kids as well. And my love area, I guess you would say, were students with more complex communication needs. So then from that position, I transferred over to the co-op where I am now. So I've been there for 3 years. And have that title of professional learning coach. And so what I do is now I coach and work with teachers and SLPs who service students in that low incidence population. So we focus a lot on training teachers and other SLPs on how to work with those kiddos who have some more complex communication needs. And so that's the position I am currently in now. Also in my free time, I work with Special Olympics, so I still am able to get that hands-on with kids and adults that I so loved when I was in the school system. So that's a little bit about me. And then you guys have just through your chatting told me about you, so we will jump right in. You know, I want this to be like a conversation. So feel free to interject questions into the chat. And Stella, you can let me know those and I can stop at any time if something pops into somebody's mind. Or we definitely will have that opportunity at the end as well. But feel free to, yeah.
I'm sorry, could you explain, we had a question, if you could explain what an AAC is and an SLP, please?
Yeah, for sure. So SLP just stands for speech language pathologist. And so that's the professionals that work with, well, you know, individuals birth through adulthood on communication. So in the schools, we focus a lot on speech and language, you know, emerging, you know, progressing language skills and speech skills. Some SLPs, though, work on, you know, feeding and voice therapy, and others will work with adults, you know, that may have had strokes or some type of a cognitive reason why they're needing some speech and language. So we cover the gamut as SLPs. So that was a good question. And then AAC, we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get in, but it stands for assistive and augmentative communication. So that's the term that's used for people, individuals who need to supplement verbal speech in some way. And we'll get a little bit more into different types of AAC and who actually needs AAC as we get further into the discussion. So great questions. Because, and sometimes I have gotten so much into the professional realm that I do use those acronyms and don't thoroughly explain them. So anytime, stop me. No question's a bad one. So we're going to talk just some ways to find the key to communication success. So throughout this hour, we're going to discuss child communication, but possibly even more than that, we're going to discuss that communication partner and what those partners, so you as parents or you as professionals, how you can work to promote communication success. So often we forget that finding that communication success really is achieved by coaching that communication partner. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And as we go through this, we're also going to discuss, we're going to talk about some expectations and how to set expectations for kiddos, as well as we'll touch just briefly on some tools and resources out there, as well as engagement and response opportunities for kiddos. So expectations, you know, that is kind of, it's almost like a seesaw. You know, expectations kind of ebb and flow and they go up and down, and it's how do you set those expectations that are tailored to your unique needs and situation. So on the screen here, you'll see I just have a little graphic that represents developmental milestones. And what I want to do is I always like to, whether it be a professional or a parent, kind of give the caveat that these milestones are great and we need to know what our developmental milestones are. But when you're dealing with a student, or I'm going to say student a lot, when you're dealing with a child that has communication needs, especially complex communication needs, you know, we want to make sure that we're using these milestones as a guide. You know, they're to guide us through this process of language development and not necessarily as a judge. Because sometimes when our students or our children are delayed in communication and we look at those milestones as a judge, you're in that cycle of forever frustration. And so we want to make sure that we're using these as a guide. This is the path that generally your language development will take place, but it's not necessarily a judge that you've missed opportunities if you haven't hit a specific developmental milestone. I have inserted in that training guide some links to the ASHA website. And so the ASHA is the overseeing organization for speech language pathologists. It stands for the American Speech and Hearing Association. So there's always lots of good information on that to guide the profession. And some links are on there that will take you specifically to websites that talk about language development information, whether it be speech development or language development. So if you're just beginning, if you're a parent listening in and you're just beginning to have concerns with your child's speech and language development, I encourage you to consult an SLP. Sometimes parents will just go to doctors, and of course I am biased because I'm a speech language pathologist, but generally, we are, your SLPs are your experts in that language development, and a lot of times they're a better reference than doctors. I've had a lot of parents throughout my career that have felt led astray by doctors, and they were hesitant to reach out to an SLP because they didn't know what they were and they didn't know that we existed. So, I do encourage people to advise parents who may just be starting this journey to consult an SLP if they think that something's wrong. And I always also like to encourage parents to follow their gut. Start conversations early. I don't think anyone has ever said that we got started too early with looking at some type of an intervention for speech and language. The worst thing that can happen is they'll tell you to wait just a little bit longer and then come back and see them if you're still concerned. So, always start those conversations early because we do want to have that expectation, that your child will follow these developmental milestones. So if you're already working with an SLP, but maybe progress isn't going quite how you think it should, I encourage everyone to start open conversations, express your language goals and your concerns for your child. And I want parents to know you don't have to be an expert in speech and language. You don't have to feel like you know all the right words to say or all the right questions to ask. You just need to have a conversation. You'll learn as you go. I think a lot of times we use that as a roadblock. I know to equate it to my personal life, sometimes I hate to have those conversations with like bankers and financial advisors or anything that has to do with numbers because I feel like I don't know enough to ask. And I think parents sometimes feel that way too when they get into these, the areas that are not their areas of expertise. But I encourage you to always just express to, start conversations, express to your SLP what your life is like, where you and your child are struggling, and to be honest about everything else you have to balance. A lot of times I feel like parents come with guilt, and guilt won't help you or your child accomplish the goals that you're going to set. So sometimes as SLPs, we get a little hyper vigilant and focused, thinking only about communication, and we forget that there's a lot that goes into a child and a family. So the more an SLP understands the specific needs of you and your child, a better plan can then be developed. So just like no two kids are alike, no two situations are alike. So we want to make sure that we aren't treating them the same. So the more your professional supports can know what's going on with you, the better they can help with those setting of expectations. So, I always just want everybody to give themselves and their child some grace when you're starting this process. So when you're, again, when you're looking at, and to go back to the kind of the theme of this, of this presentation of opening doors, you're going to start the path. And if you think you're on a path that might not be right for your child, so you're talking to an SLP and it just doesn't seem like they are having the same expectations that you have, then, it's okay to go other places and to shop around. You just want to make sure that you don't ever give up. Sometimes I know that professionally and in families, I hear people say, we tried it and it didn't work. And so they don't revisit it, so they let those opportunities, those doors close and those opportunities pass. So it's never too late. Like I said, most of my experiences with students who were a little bit older, and language is always developing. So again, thinking about those milestones, don't think a window or a door has ever closed to you or your child in regards to communication. It's never too late. So you always want to keep pressing on and trying new things. And sometimes you will have tried things and they didn't work, but maybe the next year, or a month later, it might work then once things are changed up or your child has, matured or developed a little bit. So going back, those milestones, speech and language, even if they are experiencing a delay, you will generally follow the same path. The pace may be different, and that's okay, but the milestones will generally go in that same progression. So when you're setting your expectations, it's always important that your expectations are high enough that you're going to continue to make progress, but not so high that they can never be achieved and then result in that frustration by you and your child. So sometimes, parents will say, my child isn't communicating. Well, they are. Have faith. Your child is communicating. It just might not be in the obvious ways that you are used to. So I always want parents or caregivers or professionals watch that child. Observe how he or she is communicating. Everyone and everything communicates in some way. You just have to look for it. So is the child using facial expressions? Are they using gestures, vocalizations? It might even be the intonation that they use in their vocalizations. So possibly it could be communication in those undesirable behaviors. Sometimes we're quick to jump to it's a behavior problem, when a lot of times in actuality, it's a communication problem. So those undesirable behaviors, they are more than likely a means that child is using to communicate something. So you want to watch what your child is doing, and then work with your SLP to build on that. Again, your child is communicating. It may not be that traditional fashion that you're used to, but they are communicating. So all we have to do is figure out a way to harness what they're currently doing and then build from there. Okay. And again, if one thing you're doing doesn't work, don't stop. Don't let that door close. Just try something else.
Laura, we have a question.
Okay.
This person asks, how do I get my child into speech therapy, and how do you start that process?
Okay, well, it kind of depends on the area that you're in, and sometimes what insurance looks like. Sometimes referrals need to be made from a doctor, but other times there are clinics. If you're going through the schools have a child find process, so you could contact a local school district depending on the age of your child. But they would be eligible for services through preschool, Head Start, early childhood, even first steps if you're in that birth to 3 range. So it's reaching out. If your child is at least 3, then I would start with the schools, because all of that is free and they'll know the resources and be able to get you guided in getting that process started through the school. Does that answer that question okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
All right. So this quote is one that, I always try to point out to professionals. And I think it's applicable to parents as well, that not being able to speak is not the same as not having anything to say. I mentioned that sometimes we may have undesirable behaviors that might be communication, but other times we have kiddos that just become real complacent and they're quiet. And so we don't then have that high enough expectation for them, because we're assuming they aren't talking because they don't have anything to say. And I don't find that to be true, but even if they didn't have something to say, it's our job to give them something to talk about. And we're going to talk more about that when we get into our engagement portion. So setting goals. Again, you're going to look at, you got to consider 2 things, your family and your child. So you want to be sure to think about, ultimately, no matter how old that kiddo is now, your eye and the goal always needs to be independence. Communication skills leads to independence. So what you're going to think about is, what is that one small step that my child can take to become more independent? So you may be starting at simply establishing joint attention. Okay, being able for you and your child to look at the same thing at the same time. Once that step is achieved, then you might focus on maintaining that joint attention. And it might even be for just seconds. It might be minutes, but you're just going to expand upon that, because you have to have joint attention, and imitating behaviors are the first 2 steps in that communication process getting developed. So if you have to start there, start there. It might be, if you're looking at speech sound difficulties, so your child's talking but you can't understand anything that they're saying, So it might be then you're working on that approximation. So maybe just starting with getting that child to do a beginning sound or a beginning syllable of a word. And then you're going to build upon that by adding syllables and adding sounds. So when setting goals, you know, again, it's great to collaborate with an SLP, but you're always going to look where your child is currently and build from there. And don't think that any step is too small. They all lead to bigger steps. So when one step is achieved, the other thing that's super important is to celebrate. Let your child know you've met that accomplishment. You yourself need to celebrate those accomplishments. Sometimes when the language path and the language and speech development looks so different from those milestones and so different from those other kids, or what you think of as what you think in your mind is supposed to be happening, you don't take the time to celebrate those small accomplishments. So every step, even if it may be a small step, it's a big step towards reaching your goal and that independence. And again, think about your family. So what is realistic? So often we'll set goals because, again, you have that pressure of those developmental milestones or the neighbor down the street, and you're going to set yourself up to fail. What's realistic for your child and your family? Where are you now? And take one step in the direction you want to go. So we talked about, you know, AAC, you know, that alternative and augmentative communication. That might be a route that you need to do. But you're in a goal to set, but you're going to, again, take where you are and you're going to figure out where you can put communication in your normal routine. And it might be starting that we're going to focus on communication for 5 minutes a day. And once that 5 minutes becomes routine, we're going to add another 5 minutes. So just know the communication is to me, it's so easy because think about your life. It's everywhere. So know that every experience you're having is an opportunity to build the language or the speech of your child. Language is everywhere. So the nice thing about it is you're not going to have to go out and buy special tools. You don't have to go special places. You know, language and speech, it happens in the bathtub, happens at the dinner table, in the car on the way to school, taking a walk. You know, communication is all around us. We just have to look for those opportunities. You have to learn how to see them and then kind of seize those opportunities. But with a little bit of guidance, you'll be able to get there. And then just know, of course, that you're not alone. Sometimes the communication, we think that the communication responsibility is left up to the professionals, you know, or sometimes that responsibility falls on mom or it falls on dad. Communication needs to be everybody's responsibility. You know, we're going to talk about, you know, establishing your network and your support group, other children. If you have other children in the household, they can help too. You know, it's their responsibility to help develop communication, be a good communication partner as well. So we just have to teach everybody how to prompt and respond to that communication. Sometimes we talk a lot about coaching, and I'll talk about it some more later. And when I mention coaching, what I mean by that is teaching the family, you know, and the caregivers how to do this communication and how to be a better communication partner. So, you know, sometimes when you're starting out, it might be a matter of not an SLP not telling what your child needs to do, but it's going to be focused on coaching the parents or the caregivers, what you guys need to do to help facilitate that. So again, setting those goals, you know, you want to make sure that you're looking at building communication into routines and activities, and we'll talk more about how to do that later. And then recognizing that you're going to add responsibility to your child. Sometimes I feel like when there's a lot going on and you might have a child with kind of multiple issues, you know, communication gets put and the level of responsibility, we have a lower expectation for that. But you want to make sure that as able, you can release that responsibility to the child to empower them to be their own communicator. You don't always have to be their voice. If you are always their voice, they're not going to develop theirs. I worked with a student who he would often, whenever we would, I would see him, he would look to his mom and he would say, tell her, and because he had become so used to her being his voice. And he had developed a voice of his own. He just wasn't able to break that routine, or he was struggling breaking that routine of mom being his voice. So you want to make sure that with the goals, the developmental goals, you're also setting those goals for responsibility, because with responsibility, think about our own lives. With responsibility comes pride, and it becomes self-esteem. And with self-esteem comes having something to talk about. So a kid needs a purpose and a reason to communicate. It may even be, hopefully not, but maybe that reason to communicate may even be to complain about you. But we want to make sure that every kid has that option to be able to complain about their parents or their teachers, just as any other child could. I had another student, I had mentioned to you that I worked with Special Olympics in my free time. And, just thinking about giving students and children something to talk about. I had one kid, and his bus driver asked me after he came back from a Special Olympics competition with, what I did to him. I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, I didn't know that Bobby could talk, and I've been driving his bus for 4 years. And of course, I was just shocked by this information. And I said, well, what changed? And he said he walked on that bus with the medal, and the other kids started asking him about it. And he said he hasn't stopped talking since. So we want to make sure that we are giving those kiddos something to talk about. All right, so filling your toolbox. There's a lot out there, and I put a whole lot on that training guide so that we don't have to spend time going over it now. But basically, you're going to have to decide, what's good for your family, and your child. And I just encourage you to be open to new ideas, but also don't abandon some traditional approaches when you're looking to things. So, when you're filling that toolbox, some things that you need to, I just encourage all families is to look for the positive. There's a lot of negative out there, and it's easy to find yourself kind of getting in that cycle of negativity, but there are a ton of great resources on social media. YouTube has a lot of good sites, and again, I put those on your training guide. Family members, if you either don't have family close, or maybe you're having trouble with them being supportive, build your own network of families and support. Again, the internet, and some of those things are great resources for you. But also, as you start this journey, the question was, how do I, get into speech services? I want you to know your rights. And the Kentucky Department of Education website has some great resources for parents about your rights. It has parents and family toolkits. And then it also has, some resource guides for you. So I encourage you, those links are on that page as well, that training guide, to go to those resources so that you can see what's available in your state and what your child has rights to, throughout wherever they are in their educational career. If anybody has any favorites, I network with parents a lot through our Special Olympics, and encourage them to share some of their favorite resources as far as kind of the social media sites and other websites. So if you guys have any that you want to share with one another, I encourage you to do that as well. And I asked several of my parents that I work with some of their resources, and those are included on your training guide as well. All right, so we'll jump into where to begin. Again, you're going to find those partnerships. So I encourage you to develop a relationship with schools. I have seen great family relationship with schools, and I have seen horrible ones. But you want to try to build those relationships and those partnerships within schools, and be an advocate. Don't be scared or feel hesitant to speak up. once you get in this process, there's, you have tons of meetings. There are ARCs, there are IEPs to get developed. There are all sorts of things and acronyms and situations that may make you feel uncomfortable, but I encourage you to be that advocate. Find somebody that you feel comfortable having that conversation with until your child finds his own voice. You do have to be that voice and that advocate for them. So just make sure that everyone you're around has those same high expectations for your child. Always be persistent and be positive. I've sat through so many meetings where the parents just agreed with everything, and maybe they didn't need to. So don't always just assume that everything is happening that you expect to happen. Be that advocate, because there are a whole lot of times in my career where, embarrassingly enough to me, I look back and I was not taking that right path. And it took a very persistent parent to show me differently. As a parent, you know your child the best, and you know what goals you have and what your life is like. You just have to communicate that. So, be kind of brave in taking that step to be persistent and to communicate that. And then, like I said, find those positive things. And what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about this total communication. And so when we talk about total communication, it's where you begin. Okay, so what it is all of these things you see here on the screen. Think about the ways that you communicate throughout the day. We speak, we use gestures. I use probably too many facial expressions that sometimes get me into trouble. We'll point, we might text, we use emojis, so we're using symbols, picture symbols, we're writing. We as adults with typically developing communication we communicate using a total communication approach. That's the same thing we want for our kiddos. Okay, so communication should be multimodal. Now, a lot of times when you have a student or a child with a significant communication delay, people will try to tell you that there's a progression that you have to do, that you have to go through. So you might have to start with signs, and then you have to go to picture symbols, and then you can go to that technology. There are really no rules for that. There's nothing that says first a child has to do this before they can do this. Sometimes people will say they have to have cause and effect before you can go on to any type of technology to assist their communication. Not true. You can teach it at the same time. What better way to teach cause and effect than through communication? So when your child, as long as they are communicating using an appropriate mode, you're going to accept that. Sometimes if we're using verbal speech, we'll stop accepting a head nod, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Another thing to remember is that a child may communicate using one mode if they're relaxed. So it may be very easy for them to speak or communicate when they're in your home and they're doing a favorite activity, but add a stressor or add some anxiety, and all of a sudden their communication seems non-existent. They may need another form of communication in certain situations. So they may be able to write or use verbal language in certain situations, but in other more stressful situations, you may have to back up and give them a visual or a picture support, or give them some technology to help them out. You always want to plan for how are they going to communicate on their worst day. They're usually going to communicate best with mom and dad, but how are they going to communicate when they get out in that world? Because again, we're focusing on that independence. So you're going to hear me say these three words a lot through here, in that communication needs to be fast, easy, and reliable. So the total communication approach, you want to look at what's the fastest, the easiest, and the most reliable way for that kiddo to get their point across, okay? Remembering that it has to be appropriate. So if a child is currently dragging you from place to place and pointing or grunting to what she wants, that's not an appropriate, nor is it an efficient form of communication. So that communication system should be utilized for a child to express what it is they want to communicate in a faster and easier way. Because using a system or teaching words is going to be much faster than dragging you ultimately. So you're going to have to model, what they need to do instead of dragging you. And that will take some steps. But, as long as dragging you from place to place continues to be the fastest and easiest way, then that's the way they're going to communicate. So if it's not an appropriate way, we're going to replace it with a faster and easier way to communicate. But on the other hand, your child may have a head nod, or they may be able to verbalize yes and no. There's no reason that they need to then, if they've been introduced to technology, that they have to push a button to say yes or no. That head nod is perfectly understandable. It's appropriate. It's fast and easy. So we want to make sure when you're looking at communication, you're looking at a total communication system. So what are they using? What can they use to communicate fast, easy, and reliable with mom and dad, with grandma, with the clerk at the grocery store? So total communication is always going to be the key and the goal. So we talked about AAC, and I told you that that is assistive and augmentative communication. So the fact is, sometimes kids aren't developing that verbal speech quite as fast as what we might hope for them to. But we want to make sure that we don't fall into the myth that giving them a form of technology will stifle their verbal development. So you may have that expectation that you want your child to be a verbal communicator. Giving them a technology or a device or a picture symbol to use to communicate is not abandoning that expectation that you want them to verbally communicate. It's not lowering your expectation. In fact, all the research shows that augmenting that communication with signs, objects, pictures, or devices will actually help encourage that speech development. Okay, and there are some research articles on that training guide for you as well. So when we're thinking of who might need some of this AAC, so some pictures or some objects or a device to communicate, any age, nobody's too young. Sometimes they'll tell you that you can't start until they're at a certain age. Not true. As soon as you realize your child isn't developing speech or isn't able to be understood, you can supplement them with an assistive technology device. Sometimes kids are going to have speech, but just not enough. They might not have enough vocabulary to express what they need or what's going on in their little heads. They may be only at one word and they need more than one word. So those are candidates for AAC. Those kids who I mentioned earlier who maybe have speech in some situations, but not all situations, they may need it. There may be kiddos that have no speech at all. They definitely need it. Or if their speech can't be understood. So they've got a lot of words, they've got a really big vocabulary, but you can't understand it, then they're the ones who need it. And even those kids who are talking a whole lot, but they're using scripts that we call echolalia. So they're just repeating what other people said, or they might be repeating something that they've heard from a movie or a favorite video game. They need it as well. Okay, it's not going to keep your child from verbally communicating, because remember, they want what's fastest and easiest. And AAC, although it's very beneficial, it's slow. So if verbal speech is going to develop, it will develop because it's going to be much faster and easier than that AAC. But if you don't introduce something and you wait for speech to develop, you're also slowing down that development of language, literacy, and cognition as well. So when we think about, is this working? There's a few things that you need to do that will help communication work better. So one, presume competence. So you have to believe in that child's ability and their potential to become a successful communicator. I believe that all children can and will communicate when given the right tools, okay? You also need to be flexible. So be ready to adapt and change in response to that communication. Be persistent, never give up. And then be consistent. So have those expectations, keep those expectations, and make sure that everybody in your network has those same expectations of that child. And then engaging and interacting providing those real and motivating reasons to communicate, and then be patient. Sometimes we don't allow enough of that wait time. We're too quick to jump in and communicate for them. So be patient and wait for communication to happen. You give them a little bit of wait time, doesn't happen, then you can model that communication for them. And there's some videos on your training guide that shows you how to do that. And then if they are using some kind of augmentative alternative communication, so that AAC, make it available. You know, don't leave it at home. Don't keep it on a shelf. Don't let the batteries not be charged up. So if they can't access it, they can't use it or practice it. So we want to make sure that they always have their voice with them. All right, so as you're getting into that role of being a communication builder, you're going to create that positive environment, making that communication fun and quick and easy and engaging and motivating and all of those things that communication should be. We don't want our kids to see communication as work or as a test. It has to be fun and motivating. And then you're going to model that communication. So however you and the SLP have established that's going to be best for your kid to communicate, you're going to model using that communication. So if they're using pictures for the time being, or they're using a device, you're going to do that while also using the spoken word. But however it's established for that child to communicate, you need to model that communication as well. And then you need to work on prompting. Another thing I put in your training guide is a prompt hierarchy, but we want to make sure that you don't over prompt. Sometimes it's real tempting to take that child's hand and have them push that button or pull that card or sign that sign, but we want to make sure that you're focusing on modeling that communication and not forcing it by hand over hand prompts. One of the best prompts to start out with is just that waiting expectantly. Indicate to them that you expect them to communicate. After you pause and wait, then you can interject with that modeling and give them a prompt in that way. And then you're always going to want to respond. Accept and acknowledge all forms of communication. So remember that total communication we just talked about. No matter how they're communicating, you're going to want to respond to it. Sometimes when we don't understand communication, we tend to ignore it, but we want to make sure that we're responding, and we'll talk about some ways to respond in just a minute. I know I've just gone through a whole lot. Are there any questions that I can quickly ask or give you some processing time? All right, we're going to jump into, this is my new favorite phrase, inspire, don't require. So I encourage you guys to repeat that to yourself, say it 3 times, whatever you need to do, but we want to inspire our kids to communicate and not require it. The more pressure we put on them, generally, then it becomes less fun and they pull back. So you want to make sure that, you know, we set up that environment to engage, that you're talking to the child, but you're not over talking to them. You know, sometimes it's best to speak slower, limit the number of words you use, and use that typical development, that language development as your guide, remember. So, you know, we start by saying 1 word to kiddos, and then we, you know, we'll expand that to 2-word utterances. You're going to do that the same when you're talking to kids with the language development or language delay. And again, allow that processing time, model that language, work on having that joint focus. So you're going to look at things together. You're going to point to things. You're going to name things, but don't just stop at labeling objects. You want to label emotions and comments and actions. So let their motivators, whatever motivates that kiddo, guide the language. So you can look at books together, games, sensory items, whatever they're into. Tell them stories. You can model lyrics to their favorite songs using their communication system. But you're going to want to look to what's motivating to them, not you. but what's motivating to them and how can you get them communicating about it. You know, if you can, you want to turn off the TV and those devices and play with your kiddos. But I know, believe you me, I know there's a lot of kids that can't separate or have difficulty separating from devices. Use those to make comments about them. And so you're going to use whatever it is. If they can't get away from that screen right now, use that screen and communicate about it. And then also, I do want to say that if your child is given an AAC device, and a lot of times those will come in the form of an iPad. There's a lot of apps that can go on iPads. I encourage you to have an app that's in an iPad that's dedicated strictly to as being their voice and not that they play games on. It's really hard for them to understand the difference. Plus, if they're playing games on the same device that has their communication system, they can't talk about the game, okay? So if at all possible, you wanna have, if you're using an iPad and an app on that iPad for them to communicate with you, then have it separate from the one that they play games on and those types of things. And just remember, every activity, whatever they're doing, that's an opportunity for language to be developed. So to focus a little bit on those kiddos who aren't developing that verbal language, I want you to take this graphic into consideration. We speak spoken language, you know, we use verbal language input for kiddos for typical development, and we get spoken language output. If we're looking at a kiddo who is not learning, they are not speaking, they're not following those developmental milestones, speaking to them won't necessarily get out the language that we want. So if they're going to need to use some of that AAC, spoken language will not get that aided language out, okay? So we have to speak to them in the same language. I have put some really nice videos. This strategy is called aided language input. So if you are having to use some type of an augmentative device, the videos will walk through for you on how to model for using those devices for those kids, because whatever we want out is what we have to put in. And again, whenever we're modeling on an AAC device, we are still speaking to them. So you never abandon spoken language. You pair it with the pictures or the objects or whatever they're going to use to communicate with. Because if you think about kids who are learning AAC, those kiddos, typical kids, by the time they're 18 months old, have been exposed to 4,400 hours of language input. If the child needs to be an AAC user, at that same pace generally, you know, it would take them, in order to get that many hours of language input following a traditional therapy method and not doing things at home, it would take that same kid 84 years. You know, so you want to make sure that you're talking to them using whatever their form of communication is. And it's going to be difficult at first, and it's going to be ugly, and it's going to be messy, but you'll learn it. Just as those kiddos are going to learn it. The thing is, we want to remember that we don't just give them some pictures and expect them to start communicating, or give them an iPad and expect them to start communicating. We have to teach that to them. We have to show them. And it you know, it is a hard process at first, but again, working with that SLP and having them coach you through it, and watching, you know, looking at some of those YouTube sites that I've referenced for you, you'll be able to see how to model that language, and that will help you be able to model that language for those kiddos. Again, you're going to give them something to talk about. So create and seize those opportunities. You want to make sure that you're stimulating your child, but not overstimulating them. You know, you want to provide that relaxed and engaging environment for them when you're starting communication. I always like to say that I wanted time with me to be like time spent with grandma. You know, I wanted to be the one who was the giver of all things wonderful, and so that they were more motivated to communicate. So some little tricks that you can do when you're, creating some opportunities. You can sabotage things, so meaning if you're needing your child or wanting your child to verbalize, you can take a part away from their favorite toy, so it'll give them a reason to express the need for help. You can give them a fork to eat their cereal, or their soup with. You can sabotage things to where it gives them a reason that they're going to need to talk. Trying new things, so saving that new toy or that new activity for a dedicated language time. And then, you can plan for the activity. So look at your day and then focus on that one time that you're going to build in communication. And so it should be a time when you're following that child's lead, following what motivates them, and then engaging some of these communication strategies into it. And making a note, again, we're not going to force. So if they can only tolerate, a partner activity for a couple of minutes, then just start with a couple minutes, start with a couple seconds. But be spontaneous and silly, and then be age appropriate as well. And I know we're getting short on time. Let me go real quick here on this responding. So like I said before, you're going to want to acknowledge all attempts at communication, even if you think it was an accident, or even if you think it had no meaning. You're going to attribute meaning to it. So if there's some vocalizations or some verbalizations, you want to figure out what they're meaning by that. Treat it as a communication attempt. If they have a device and they're pushing a button over and over again, don't assume they're just perseverating on it. Make that communicative. Teaching them that using this device or using this picture has this response, or saying this word will get me that response. It's that cause and effect. And then expand. So if a child says more, you can model back want more. If a child says, if they're at that one word level, expand it to 2 words, making things more complex. And then this last step 3, it's called recasting. And what I mean by that is you're going to shape a message. So you may have taught the child the word go. And of course, we can use that word go for lots of different things. It can mean go away. It can mean they want to go someplace. They need to go to the bathroom. They might want a turn in a game and go. So this is when you're going to look at that situation that your child's in, and then you may recast it. So if a child is saying the word go and they're looking at a game board that you might be playing, you can recast that to say, oh, you want to go. You can also say my turn and model that. So show them a way to even make that communication more specific. Another article that I have in your training guide is from a parent. It's called Are You a Mind Reader? And I think it's a great example of making sure you acknowledge, expand, and recast that communication attempts of your kiddos. And then the last thing is, just encourage and include peers. So there's so much research on kids who have the opportunities to talk to other kids. They're less likely to be alone on the playground. They're more likely to be named as a friend. The key is those peers have to be taught, just as you have to be coached on how to respond to the communication differences, peers do too. But take that, initiative and take that extra effort to try to teach other kids how to communicate with your kiddo with the communication delay, and vice versa. Because if they're only interacting with adults, they're only going to interact with adults. And it's always much easier for a child with a speech or language delay to interact with adults. And if you think about the reason why, why are they interacting only with adults? That's because adults are the ones that are responding to them. They're the ones who are acknowledging them. So if we can teach peers to respond to them and acknowledge them, then they are going to be more likely to engage in communication with their peers. And so we want to make sure that is not an aspect that we are not including in whatever therapy plan, whether it be at school or private therapy or your goals at home, but that you do try to plan for eventually, engaging other peers to communicate with them, because that's the key for them generalizing that communication and causing that communication to continue to grow into all settings and into, again, ultimately that independence, because we want them to be, eventually we want all of our kiddos to be able to go someplace without an adult and without that adult right next to them. And so if they can do those same things with a peer as giving them support, that's always much preferred from having an adult give them that extra support. And then again, just lastly, I'm reiterating, I told you you'd hear it a million times. You're going to make it fast, fun, and easy. And then again, the final thought is my favorite new phrase, is that inspire and don't require. When I was in a school just a couple of weeks ago, I was coaching a brand new first-year preschool teacher. Can you imagine starting your teaching career during this pandemic? But we were modeling communication during breakfast with this preschooler, and we put a communication board in front of him because he was one of those who drug people everywhere. He was a grunter and a thrower, and he would drag his teachers all over the place. And he was doing great with this communication board, and he was starting to look at it and engage with it. And so naturally, the teacher got real excited. So she started increasing those demands and demanding, instead of just modeling that communication, demanding that response. And as soon as too much pressure was put on that child, that's when he started throwing that board. He took it and started throwing it. And so we just had to teach that that was a sign. He was communicating that he was getting too overwhelmed with that. And we were starting to require too much, and we were forgetting to inspire that communication. So anyway, so that is kind of some quick overview of communication tips. And I think I could do a whole hour training on each one of those individually, which is sometimes what I am most used to doing. Ask any questions. Feel free. My email is on that training guide. It's right here on the slide in front of you. Reach out to me at any time, because I know I just did a pretty fast and furious overview of language development and being a communication partner.
Laura, what great tips. I mean, those were some great resources and tools, and I know everybody's going to be extremely excited to get, if they didn't get to download it, to get that training handout packet in the email later this afternoon. So we're kind of short on time, but I do have a really quick, someone did have a quick question. If you could give me the control back, and I will show them this last slide, and then we can, I'll ask you this question real quick. It says, my child has autism and has frequent meltdowns and disruptive behaviors. Is there something that a speech pathologist is this something a speech pathologist is trained in? And will he need a speech teacher that is cross-trained in behavior therapy?
Yes. Yes and yes. So it's something that speech pathologists should know how to handle, because, I believe that those meltdowns and disruptive behavior are communication. And so that's when you get into, it's the evidence-based practice of functional communication training. And so it's a way, it's the process of shaping those meltdowns and disruptive behavior and replacing them with that appropriate communicative response. So why is that child melting down? What is that situation? What are they trying to communicate? And then giving them that appropriate replacement behavior for that, to again make that appropriate communication faster, easier, and more reliable. It's really what it boils down to. The child's meltdowns are probably ultimately getting him or her what she wants, and those disruptive behaviors, but I guarantee they aren't getting that child what he or she wants fast and efficiently. So if he can be given those tools of that appropriate replacement communicative behavior that will be faster and easier, then you'll see the meltdowns and the disruptive behavior lessening. Now, there are some SLPs have official, ABA certifications as well. That doesn't happen often, but generally, but that's not necessarily needed. But that's also not to say that you couldn't partner, with ABA and speech therapy if you felt you needed to have, that approach. But both disciplines are going to use that evidence-based practice of functional communication training, or they should. Sometimes when you look at it just solely as behavior and you just look at ABA, it forgets that communication aspect. So ideally, kind of merging those two experts could get you a really great, a great result with that. But yeah, it's functional communication training is what that kiddo is needing, and an SLP should be able to do that.
That was great. Thank you so much. And we really appreciate you being our guest speaker today. I think the information has been wonderful, and I know all of our folks that have been on and those that will watch it later online are going to really appreciate the resources and the information. We just want to give you all just a little heads up. We do Tuesday tips every Tuesday, and then we have webinars on Thursday. So please visit our website at www.kyspin.com for all of those, all of that information and ways you can register for our next webinar. And when you end today, there'll be an evaluation. If you could please complete that for us. It just takes a few minutes, and it kind of lets us know how we're doing and maybe some suggestions that you may have for us for the future. Again, thanks, Laura, for joining us, and we hope y'all have a wonderful day.